I just want them back. I just want them to come back. And if they're not safe right now, that's what's tearing me apart. Because if they are safe, they're coming back. But if they're not, this has got to stop. Like, somebody has to come forward.
For most people, life sentences mean fading quietly into obscurity. For Chris Watts, that has never happened. Even years after his conviction, his daily life inside prison walls continues to attract attention, speculation, and controversy. By 2025, Watts is no longer the newly convicted inmate adjusting to incarceration. He is now a long-term prisoner who has settled into a routine shaped by strict rules, limited freedom, and constant surveillance. Watts is currently housed in a maximum security facility in Wisconsin, where he has spent most of his sentence since being transferred for safety reasons. Inmates serving high-profile life sentences are often placed in protective environments, not for comfort, but to reduce the risk of violence from other prisoners. According to available reports and former inmates familiar with similar facilities, this type of housing involves restricted movement, controlled social interaction, and close monitoring by correctional staff. Inside the prison, Watts follows a structured schedule that rarely changes. His days begin early, often before sunrise, with cell checks and roll calls. Meals are served at fixed times. Recreation is limited. Privacy is almost non-existent. Unlike the public image of prison as chaotic and unpredictable, long-term inmates experience a rigid, repetitive system designed to eliminate personal control. Over time, this routine becomes both a survival tool and a psychological burden. By 2025, multiple sources indicate that Watts has been assigned institutional work, including kitchen duties and maintenance-related tasks. These jobs are not privileges in the traditional sense. They are part of the prison's operational system and are used to evaluate behavior, discipline, and compliance. Inmates who refuse to work or violate rules often lose access to limited benefits such as phone calls, visitation, or commissary items. One of the most discussed aspects of Watts' prison life has been his communication with people outside the facility. Over the years, he has exchanged letters with supporters, religious groups, and female pen pals. Some of these letters, which later surfaced online, reveal his efforts to present himself as spiritually transformed. He frequently writes about faith, forgiveness, and personal change. He describes himself as someone who has found God and claims to reflect daily on his actions. However, prison staff and crime analysts caution against interpreting such statements at face value. Long-term inmates often adopt religious or reflective language as a coping mechanism. Others use it strategically to maintain outside support. In Watts' case, critics point out that his writings tend to focus more on his own emotional state than on the suffering of his victims. This pattern has raised doubts about whether his expressions represent genuine accountability. Despite being cut off from society, Watts remains emotionally connected to the outside world through controlled phone calls, monitored correspondence, and limited visitation. These connections allow him to follow public discussions about his case. According to people familiar with similar inmates, awareness of public opinion can deeply affect long-term prisoners, reinforcing either remorse or resentment. By 2025, Watts is no longer adjusting to prison. He is embedded in it. His identity has shifted from suburban father to institutionalized offender. His life is now defined by locked doors, regulated movement, and distant memories of freedom. Yet, even within this confined environment, his story continues to evolve, shaped by what he says, how he behaves, and how others interpret his actions. This is the reality of Chris Watts today. A man serving life, living in isolation, watched constantly, and still trying to control how the world sees him. While Chris Watts' physical world is confined to prison walls, his influence and presence extend far beyond them through written words. Letters, emails, and recorded phone calls have become his primary way of shaping how people perceive him. By 2025, dozens of these communications have circulated online, analyzed by journalists, researchers, and true crime communities. Together, they form a complex and often contradictory portrait of a man who continues to rewrite his own narrative. One of the most striking patterns in Watts' correspondence is his repeated emphasis on spiritual rebirth. He frequently describes himself as saved, redeemed, or forgiven. In several letters, he claims that prayer and Bible study have helped him understand his past behavior. He presents his faith as proof that he is no longer the person who committed the murders. For some readers, these statements appear sincere. For others, they resemble carefully constructed messages designed to soften public judgment. These letters often follow a predictable structure. Watts begins by expressing gratitude for support. He then discusses religious reflections, personal struggles, and daily routines. Finally, he closes with messages of hope and encouragement. Missing from many of these writings, however, is detailed acknowledgement of the harm he caused. References to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste are usually brief and abstract. The focus remains centered on his internal journey rather than the devastation left behind. In private communications, Watts has sometimes offered alternative versions of events that conflict with his official confession. According to individuals who have shared excerpts of their correspondence, he occasionally suggests that external pressures, emotional manipulation, or mental confusion influenced his actions. These subtle shifts in responsibility have alarmed legal experts and psychologists, who view them as signs of incomplete accountability. Phone calls recorded by prison authorities provide additional insight. In several conversations released through public records requests, Watts speaks calmly and casually, even when discussing serious topics. He jokes, makes small talk, and asks about everyday matters. This emotional flatness has been noted by investigators since the original interrogation. Years later, it appears largely unchanged. Outside witnesses who have interacted with Watts through mail or visitation describe mixed experiences. Some report polite, respectful conversations focused on religion and self-improvement. Others say he avoids deep discussions about the crimes altogether. When questioned directly, he often redirects the conversation toward faith, forgiveness, or future hopes that he knows will never materialize. Criminologists note that long-term inmates often develop what is called a narrative survival strategy. This involves creating a version of themselves that allows them to live with their past without psychological collapse. For Watts, this narrative appears centered on spiritual redemption and emotional distancing. Whether this reflects genuine transformation or emotional self-protection remains unclear. What is clear is that Watts remains deeply invested in how he is perceived. Every letter, every call, every statement serves a purpose. Even behind bars, he continues to manage his image, selecting words carefully and avoiding topics that could expose deeper truths. By 2025, his communications no longer resemble spontaneous expressions. They resemble controlled performances. Through them, Watts is still speaking to the world, not from a courtroom or television studio, but from a narrow cell where reputation has become one of the few things he can still influence. While Chris Watts has spent years behind bars, people who once knew him and those who encountered him after his arrest have continued to speak out. Their accounts offer a different perspective, one that cannot be filtered through letters or carefully written statements. These outside voices help reveal how Watts was seen before the murders, during the investigation, and in the years that followed. Former co-workers at Anadarko Petroleum, where Watts worked at the time of the crimes, have repeatedly described him as quiet, reliable, and almost invisible. He rarely discussed personal problems. He avoided conflict. Supervisors considered him dependable. This reputation played a major role in why many people initially struggled to believe he could be responsible for such violence. In interviews conducted after his arrest, several co-workers admitted they had overlooked warning signs because he seemed too normal to suspect. Friends and neighbors have shared similar reflections. Many recall Watts as a devoted father who attended school events and helped with household chores.
Almost 7 o'clock at night. She's still going. Time for night. Good night. Good night, Cece. Love you. Good night, Cece.
He often pushed his daughters in a stroller through the neighborhood and participated in family activities. These memories now exist alongside security footage and interrogation recordings, creating a disturbing contrast between public behavior and private reality. Shannon's close friends were among the first to recognize that something was wrong. In the days leading up to her disappearance, she had confided in them about marital tension, financial stress, and emotional distance. Text messages later recovered by investigators revealed that she feared her marriage was collapsing. These friends have since spoken openly about how isolated Shanann felt in her final weeks and how little support she received from her husband. Law enforcement officers involved in the case have also offered important insights. Detectives who conducted Watts' interrogation have described him as unusually compliant yet evasive. He answered questions politely, but avoided emotional engagement. When confronted with evidence, he adjusted his story rather than admitting responsibility. Investigators later stated that this pattern suggested long-standing habits of deception and emotional detachment. In the years after his conviction, journalists and researchers have interviewed people who encountered Watts in prison-related settings, including chaplains, volunteers, and former inmates. Some describe him as quiet and respectful. Others report that he keeps emotional distance and rarely forms close bonds. According to several accounts, Watts prefers relationships that remain controlled and limited, reducing the risk of confrontation. One of the most controversial groups of outside witnesses has been the individuals who chose to support Watts after his conviction. Some correspondents claim they believe in his redemption. Others express fascination with the case. These supporters have occasionally shared private messages online, revealing how Watts responds to sympathy and admiration. Critics argue that this attention reinforces unhealthy patterns and discourages full accountability. Psychologists who have reviewed interviews, letters, and testimony from people who knew Watts emphasize a recurring theme: emotional suppression. Throughout his adult life, he avoided expressing anger, fear, or dissatisfaction directly. Instead, he internalized conflict until it surfaced in destructive ways. This pattern appears consistently in witness statements from different stages of his life. Taken together, these outside voices paint a complex picture. Watts was not perceived as violent, unstable, or dangerous. He was seen as dependable, reserved, and cooperative. Yet behind that image existed unresolved tension, secrecy, and emotional isolation. These testimonies remind us that crimes of this nature rarely emerge from obvious chaos. They often grow quietly, hidden behind routine and politeness. And in Watts' case, those who knew him best were left questioning how much they truly understood the man they thought they knew. To understand Chris Watts' actions, investigators and experts have spent years examining not just what he did, but how he thought. Behind the calm voice, polite manners, and quiet lifestyle existed a mindset shaped by emotional avoidance, fear of conflict, and a deep need for control. By studying his behavior before and after the crimes, psychologists have identified patterns that help explain how his private world slowly collapsed. Throughout his marriage, Watts rarely expressed frustration directly. Friends and relatives described him as someone who kept the peace at all costs. When disagreements arose, he would withdraw rather than confront them. Instead of communicating dissatisfaction, he absorbed it. Over time, this created a growing emotional pressure that had no healthy outlet. Experts describe this as passive suppression, a habit of burying negative feelings until they become overwhelming. This pattern became more visible in the months leading up to the murders. Financial problems, relationship strain, and the pressure of maintaining a perfect family image intensified. At the same time, Watts was involved in an extramarital relationship that offered him escape and emotional validation. For the first time, he experienced life without domestic responsibilities. This contrast deepened his internal conflict. One life represented obligation, stress, and accountability, while the other promised freedom and admiration. Rather than resolving this conflict through honest conversation or separation, Watts chose secrecy. He lied repeatedly to his wife, his coworkers, and his friends. Each lie allowed him to delay confrontation. Psychologists note that prolonged deception often creates a psychological split, where individuals begin to see their lives as separate realities. In Watts' case, this division became extreme. He was living as two different people, devoted father at home, unattached partner elsewhere. As pressure increased, his thinking became increasingly rigid. Investigators later found that Watts had begun imagining a future without his family months before the crimes. Text messages and digital records revealed discussions about starting over, financial planning, and personal freedom. These were not impulsive fantasies. They were signs of long-term detachment. During police interrogations, his emotional responses reflected this psychological distancing. While discussing the deaths of his children, he showed limited visible distress. His tone remained controlled. His language was vague. He spoke about events as if they had happened to someone else. Experts describe this as dissociation, a mental defense that separates emotions from action to reduce psychological pain. After his imprisonment, this pattern did not disappear. Instead, it evolved. His religious focus, repeated emphasis on forgiveness, and carefully framed narratives can be interpreted as new coping mechanisms. Rather than confronting the full moral weight of his actions, he reframed his identity around redemption. This allowed him to survive emotionally within prison walls. Criminologists stress that Watts does not fit the stereotype of an impulsive or openly aggressive offender. He represents a more unsettling category: individuals who appear stable, responsible, and harmless, yet carry unresolved psychological fractures beneath the surface. When combined with secrecy and emotional isolation, these fractures can lead to catastrophic outcomes. What makes his case so disturbing is not just the violence itself, but how quietly it developed. There were no public breakdowns, no dramatic warnings, no obvious signs of collapse. Instead, the danger grew in silence, hidden behind routines and smiles. By 2025, experts largely agree that Watts' greatest struggle is not physical confinement, but psychological confrontation. As long as he maintains emotional distance and controlled narratives, true accountability remains incomplete. His mind, like his prison cell, remains locked, protecting him from the full reality of what he has done. By the time Chris Watts entered his 7th year in prison, public interest in his case had not faded. Instead, it had shifted. The focus was no longer only on what happened in 2018, but on how he was living, what he was saying, and whether he was still being truthful. Between 2023 and 2025, a series of small controversies and online revelations kept his name in the spotlight. One of the biggest sources of debate has been the release of private letters and messages. Several individuals who corresponded with Watts shared portions of their conversations online, sometimes without his consent. These messages revealed how carefully he manages his tone. He often presents himself as gentle, reflective, and misunderstood. In some cases, he expresses frustration about being judged solely by his crimes, suggesting that people refuse to see his growth. These leaks sparked backlash. Critics accused Watts of trying to rebuild sympathy through selective storytelling. Advocates argued that any attempt to reshape his image dishonors Shanann and her children. Each time a new message surfaced, social media erupted with renewed anger, reminding the public that forgiveness and accountability are not the same thing. Another controversy involved his reported access to personal items, including photographs and letters from supporters. Petitions circulated online demanding stricter restrictions on what he could keep in his cell. Many people felt that allowing a convicted family murderer to maintain emotional connections was inappropriate. Others argued that basic human contact is necessary for prison management. The debate exposed deep divisions about punishment, rehabilitation, and justice. Rumors about Watts' daily life also spread rapidly. Stories about his work assignments, living conditions, and interactions with other inmates circulated on blogs and forums. Some reports claimed he was isolated and disliked. Others suggested he had adjusted comfortably. Because prisons release little detailed information, these accounts were often impossible to verify. Yet they shaped public perception regardless of accuracy. True crime creators played a major role in keeping these narratives alive. YouTube channels, podcasts, and online documentaries analyzed every development, sometimes exaggerating minor details for dramatic effect. While some creators focused on verified information, others blurred the line between reporting and speculation. This created an environment where facts and rumors often merged. Watts himself appeared aware of this attention. In several communications, he acknowledged knowing that people still discuss him online. He expressed confusion over why the case remained popular. Analysts interpret this as another sign of his ongoing concern with public image. Even in isolation, he continues to measure himself against outside opinion. Meanwhile, Shanann's family has repeatedly asked for privacy. They have spoken about the emotional toll of seeing the case resurface again and again. Each new rumor, article, or video reopens wounds that never fully healed. Their voices serve as a reminder that behind every headline lies permanent loss. By 2025, the pattern was clear. No major legal changes had occurred. No new trials were pending. Yet Chris Watts remained a public figure. His story survived through fragments, leaked messages, online debates, and unresolved questions. What began as a criminal case had evolved into a long-running public narrative, fueled by curiosity, outrage, and unanswered doubts. And as long as those doubts remain, the controversy surrounding Watts is unlikely to disappear. One of the most visible changes in Chris Watts' life after his conviction has been his deep involvement in religion. Within months of entering prison, he began attending Bible study groups, participating in chapel services, and corresponding with religious organizations. By 2025, faith had become the central theme of his public identity. Nearly every message he sends includes references to prayer, forgiveness, and spiritual growth. Watts often describes his conversion as a turning point. In letters, he claims that reading scripture helped him confront his past and find peace. He writes about feeling reborn and guided by divine purpose. According to him, faith provided structure in a place designed to strip away individuality. It gave him a language to explain suffering and a framework to survive long-term confinement. Prison chaplains who work with life-sentenced inmates note that religious commitment is common in high-security facilities. For many prisoners, spirituality becomes a way to cope with guilt, loneliness, and hopelessness. Some find genuine comfort in belief. Others adopt religious language because it offers social support and emotional protection. In Watts' case, it is difficult to separate sincere conviction from psychological survival. Critics have questioned whether his religious expressions reflect true remorse. They point out that his writings rarely center on the victim's experiences. Instead, they focus on his personal struggle, his relationship with God, and his hope for inner peace. This inward focus has led some observers to accuse him of using religion as a shield rather than a path to accountability. Watts has also spoken about believing he is forgiven by God. This idea has sparked intense debate. For many people, forgiveness implies moral reconciliation. When applied to violent crime, it raises uncomfortable questions. Can spiritual forgiveness coexist with lifelong punishment? Does personal redemption lessen responsibility? Watts' statements often suggest that he views forgiveness as emotional closure, even though his legal sentence remains unchanged. In several letters, he encourages others to find faith, positioning himself as a source of spiritual guidance. Some recipients describe these messages as uplifting. Others find them disturbing, arguing that a convicted murderer should not present himself as a moral example. This tension reflects a broader conflict between religious compassion and public outrage. Religion has also influenced how Watts interprets his own past. He sometimes frames his crimes as part of a fallen period before salvation. Psychologists warn that this framing can unintentionally minimize responsibility by separating actions from identity. Instead of fully integrating guilt, offenders may place blame on a former version of themselves. Within prison, Watts' religious involvement has reportedly earned him a reputation as compliant and disciplined. Participation in chapel programs can improve institutional standing and reduce conflicts. While this does not indicate moral reform, it suggests strategic adaptation to prison life. By 2025, faith is no longer just part of Watts' routine. It is the foundation of how he explains himself to the world. Whether it represents genuine transformation or emotional self-defense remains uncertain. What is clear is that religion has become his primary lens for understanding his past, enduring his present, and justifying his future. And in that spiritual framework, many of the hardest questions about guilt, responsibility, and irreparable loss remain unresolved. Years behind bars have transformed Chris Watts' life in ways the public can only partially observe. From the outside, it is easy to imagine prison as a place of punishment alone. But for Watts, it has been a complex mix of routine, reflection, and public scrutiny. His days are regimented, controlled, and heavily monitored, yet even within these walls, he continues to influence conversations about his case through letters, messages, and carefully framed narratives. Watts' communications reveal a man focused on survival and self-image. He presents himself as repentant, spiritually transformed, and forgiven, yet many experts argue that these statements serve more to manage perception than to acknowledge the full weight of his crimes. In private correspondence and through interactions with supporters, he carefully crafts an identity that is safe, controlled, and emotionally distant, a reflection of the same behaviors that allowed him to maintain a facade for years before the murders. Outside voices from former coworkers, neighbors, family friends, and even victims' advocates continue to challenge his narrative. They remind the public that behind spiritual language and reflective letters lies the reality of lost lives. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. No letter, call, or claim of redemption can undo the profound consequences of his actions, and for many, this remains the most important truth. Psychologists and criminologists studying Watts emphasize a recurring theme. Emotional suppression, deception, and the need for control were central to his behavior both before and after the crimes. Even now, years later, his story serves as a cautionary tale about how ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary violence, and how personal narratives can be manipulated to create distance from responsibility. As of 2025, Watts' life is defined by confinement, observation, and ongoing public fascination. He exists in a state where every movement, every message, and every interaction is scrutinized. While some of his letters suggest remorse, and his religious focus signals adaptation, the unanswered questions remain. Has he truly confronted his actions, or is he still shaping the story in a way that keeps himself at the center? The Watts case will continue to captivate, disturb, and provoke debate because it exposes the uncomfortable truths about human behavior, morality, and accountability. It is a story not just of crime, but of control, perception, and the complex ways in which people attempt to survive, both in life and behind bars. For the world outside, it serves as a reminder that some crimes leave consequences that no prison sentence, no letters, and no claims of redemption can ever erase.